Hi. Um, Thanks so much for coming out today to this rainy day in Oslo. I just came from warmer temperatures, so I'm still adjusting. My last name's not algae, that grows in water. Uh, it's like usually an infection. I just had an aloe plant that was infected with algae, a max isle, but it's okay. It's not a big deal. So I'm going to talk about a new economic order with justice at its core, and I find this graphic indicative because it is actually peasants fighting in the Philippines jungle. And in fact, these are not a type of people we normally think about as central to the struggle for justice in our world system. We often will have an imaginary filled with people who look more like ourselves. And in fact, I think what happens in the jungle of the Philippines is going to end up being more determinative in terms of a struggle for a better system than here in some ways, not in others, although everybody has their role to play, and the idea is to play it together. And so I want to go from there, from guerrilla struggle to Alice in Wonderland, and who reminded us that we do need to know where we want to go with quite some specification. And the other thing we need to think about is how we're going to get there. And then finally, we have to think better about where we are, because in fact, we often feel that we agree about where we are, but I'm not sure it's the case, right? We might be able to describe it with similar words, but we might end up using similar words to talk and mean different things. Or to use a medical analogy, we need an accurate diagnosis of the pathologies within the social system in order to arrive at an appropriate course of treatment, an appropriate prescription. So I want to begin very briefly, and I'm also intimidated by Kate's slides. Like I just make these using PowerPoint. I think she has a professional. Like I just have myself. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of our world, and I'm gonna bring you right into a kind of explicitly political economy or Marxist analysis, frankly. But even then, I'm going to go a little further. I mean, so there's a debate within leftist circles or political economists, right? If it's widely agreed that we live in a capitalist world, which I think everybody agrees on. Some people like at Davos like it, some people hate it. Trump enjoys it thoroughly. The question is, what does that mean, right? One argument is that capitalism is more or less flat, right? It's not that polarized. Everyone is eventually going to become a worker, right? You're going to be a worker, you have a boss, you're going to overthrow the boss, that's going to create a better world, right? Okay, this has no connection with reality, right? Like, this is not how historical capitalism has worked. In fact, what we see at an empirical level is that we see a deep polarization in capitalism, right? On the one hand, we see levels of employment which are markedly different, right? And you look at Latin America, you look at Africa, which suffered from all sorts of pathologies and continues to suffer from them, which are externally imposed. You look at access to per capita electricity, right? The lowest country in the world, or the lowest territory, historically has been the Gaza Strip, where I lived 15 years ago, which almost has zero per capita electricity use, right? So these indicators tell us that development is inherently polarized. They don't tell us why development is inherently polarized, right? What produced this and what reproduces it? This is what we need to understand if we want to change it, right? So basically, 3 words, right? What creates an uneven world? Slavery, the slave trade, right? Colonialism, that is the creation of empires and the denial of political self-determination to subject peoples, including, of course, the wholesale genocide of them, ongoing today in Palestine, and also imperialism, which is the modern stage of capitalism and can occur alongside formerly sovereign nation states within the world system. So because it's the most relevant for our contemporary understanding, I'm going to focus a little bit on imperialism and what it has done and what it continues to do, right? So it's a historical stage in which strong nation states, America, Norway, the UK, take control of the productive forces of weaker nation states. Productive forces are factories, our land. The control can be direct, it can be indirect, it can be through holding companies, it can be through GATT rules, it can be through native collaborators with imperialism, and then use that control to maintain a system of polarized accumulation. That is, wealth piles up in some places, want piles up in others, development piles up in some places, underdevelopment piles up in others. And then it's also about ensuring the political architecture that maintains this process. That's a fancy way of saying that there's a connection between wars and imperialism and uneven development, right? And those wars are concrete. And this is always the hardest thing to discuss in these spaces, right? Because we're very conditioned to find justifications for those wars, not seeing that creating justifications or exceptions for one or another war is what produces the system of uneven accumulation, right? We're encouraged intellectually, ideologically, morally, spiritually to see separations between these things that, as part of a historical fabric, are one historical fabric, right? These countries aren't going to war just because they feel like it, or because they have like a madman at the helm or so forth, or like there's this pathological figure of Netanyahu or Trump. No, the wars are continuous, right? If the wars are continuous, they're causally related to the underdevelopment that's occurring in the world system, right? Now, this is also very much related to the ecology. We can't be separating it out from the ecology, although I think maybe we shouldn't use the term ecological imperialism. What this means is that there's uneven ecological effects. We all know, we all read in the news, okay, when the typhoon is hitting in Southeast Asia, or when the cyclone is hitting Mozambique, or when the earthquake hits Haiti, right? When the hurricane hits Puerto Rico, what happens is that these territories are much more subject to natural disaster, one, because of where they're located and because they're more vulnerable intrinsically to anthropogenic climate change, but second of all, even more so because their infrastructure is underdeveloped because of imperialism, right? Second of all, there's a greater exposure to environmental toxins. Health provisions are not as advanced, and this is because if a country tries to do that, what will happen? They're going to get overthrown, right? If a country's like, oh no, our workers need to be protected from the chemicals you use in that industrial plant, the US is like, well, okay, that's nice, but we're going to have to overthrow you too, right? And of course, the US is trying to overthrow governments at least once a month, right? So this is very much related to imperialism. It's also related to the ecology. Again, we can't separate out these things. So this occurs through the modern political construction and reconstruction of the periphery, which is another way of saying the global south, which is another way of saying the underdeveloped countries. This occurs through sanctions, which are also very seldom discussed, right? But on the right are the countries that are subject basically to US unilateral and multilateral sanctions. That is most of the world. The US is not allowing a free trading system, right? Like free market, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, so forth. No, the US doesn't allow it, right? It weaponizes the interdependence and punishes countries like Zimbabwe for taking land from white settlers and giving it to poor black people. It gets punished by the US and the EU for that, right? Then there's war, what's happening in Iran, and then there's settler colonialism. That's Rafah, which I visited when it was a nice city. Now, it's flattened, right? This is related. So why is this important? It's important because these are obstacles about where do we want to go. And I'm sorry for being presumptive. You don't have to agree with this, but you should. So where do we want to go? Eco-socialism, that is worldwide guaranteed access to basic social goods, health, infrastructure, electricity, more or less permanently sustainable patterns of production. If you like it, the donut, and then I don't have to explain it because it's already been much better explained, right? Worldwide, more or less same equivalent levels of development. That is, people in different parts of the world all deserve the same level of development, fundamentally, right? Equal per capita access to energy, right? Everyone therefore deserves more or less the same access to the same amount of energy. And then equal labor distribution on a world scale. Everyone should have to work the same, right? Some people should not be working 20 hours a day. If people in some country are working in mines, then people in other countries should work in mines, or everyone together should develop the technology so that no one has to work in mines, right? But where do we want to go is only part of the issue. The other issue is, how do we get there from where we are, right? These are just, this is, might be a bit like labyrinthine, but basically there's an argument that according to this kind of flat capitalism thesis, that everyone's going to become workers, they're going to fight with their bosses, they're going to overthrow their governments, and that's going to produce this kind of utopia. Okay, that's just a fantasy, right? The first world doesn't produce revolutions. It'd be nice if it did, but it doesn't, right? In a polarized capitalism, people like peasants who become guerrillas in the jungle are much more prone to carrying out revolutions. And we know this from the experience of Asian revolutions. And we know that the conflict spots in the world system that have produced radicalized governments, like Latin America, like Zimbabwe, like the governments in the Sahel, in West Africa, these are countries with an underdeveloped form of capitalism where people are only partially and poorly incorporated into the world labor market, right? And so this argument says those are countries are the weak link, and this is then the social subject, right? But this doesn't mean they're going to do it by themselves, right? We have to think, what does it mean to build with people who do not necessarily look like the people in this room, and who live in countries that don't necessarily look like Oslo? I mean, Oslo, I don't know, Oslo is really far north. Like very few countries look like Norway. Now, the northern face of this struggle is things that we've been discussing, right? Decommodification of necessary services. That is, everyone should have access to things like health, infrastructure, and so forth as human rights. They shouldn't be a question of your income, right? This is very radical for Americans, like, because everything is mediated through income. Second, anti-imperialism. That is, people need to oppose their governments, right? No one else is gonna do it. And it's not just the burden of people in the other part of the world to die to resist the actions of governments in the core, in the wealthier countries. Demilitarization, that is, there should be the dismantling. The northern militaries are not used for reasons of self-defense. They're used for the reasons of offense. And then finally, the payment of climate debt, climate reparations, right, which are estimated to have been demanded on the order of $6 trillion a year, right? The southern face of this struggle looks very different, right? Southern countries are under-industrialized, so they need sovereign industrialization. That is industrialization which doesn't depend on northern technology. Or if it does, it depends on it only as an initial process of transfer. Technology cannot be a means of maintaining control of southern economies. Agrarian reform. Most countries in the third world need some level of agrarian reform. They need to break up the landed estates. And when they break up the landed estates, they need to not be facing local or US death squads, right? This is literally what happens. The Cold War was basically a war against peasant-oriented agrarian reforms, right? It was a savage war. And who were killed were parties and peasants who wanted nothing more than to actually have their own land, right? That is, these countries also need national development. That is not just local development, which is a bit more in vogue. No, they need a national level planning carried out by states, right? They need ecological planning. It goes without saying. They also need to resist imperialism. That is, they need to be supported politically, ideologically, when they resist imperialism, because that just means they have the political space to carry out their own agenda. You don't have the political space to carry out your own agenda if you're being aggressed on your borders, right? If you're getting bombed. Iran cannot carry out a project of planning if it is being bombed by Israel and the United States, right? It just can't happen. It cannot enter the donut, right, if it's getting bombed. It just cannot happen. So this is when I'm getting to my conclusion. I mean, and I had to say something about growth and degrowth. So this brings us to the point that in this framework, some things are going to grow and other things are going to degrow, right? Southern agricultural production, southern industrialization, climate debt repayments, those are going to grow. The US military is going to degrow to zero very quickly, God willing, right? this is what we want to see. And so I wanted to finish with someone from your part of the world, who very bravely was just on a boat to the Gaza Strip, understanding that the ecological issue and the climate issue are actually inseparable from the issue of the national liberation of oppressed peoples in the world system, especially our Palestinian brothers and sisters who are currently facing a genocide in Gaza and more broadly, right? And I think we should heed these words, even if it's a tall call to action. We need to take it seriously and think about what that means for our own political work as we think about what it would take to actually converge to a very different world. So thank you very much.